Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for our last but not least book forum series as a part of our Rethinking Iran initiative here at SAIS Johns Hopkins University. We're actually really thrilled to have a SAIS along with us today. Although it's in the virtual world, he is virtually back at his alma mater where he did his MA at SAIS. So for all of those SAIS students tuning in, you can see what your potential future could look like if you go in the academic realm rather than the policy realm. So we're really thrilled to have with us today Dr. Eric Lob, who's an associate professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the Florida International University. His research focuses on the intersections of development and politics in the Middle East. Dr. Lob is the author of the great book we're going to be talking about today, Iran's Reconstruction Jihad, Rural Development and Regime Consolidation After 1979, which just came out last year through Cambridge University Press. The project is based on Dr. Lob's 2013 dissertation at Princeton University, and that dissertation won the Foundation for Iranian Studies Annual Award for the Best Dissertation and the Honorable Mention for the Association for Iranian Studies Biannual Mashayikhi Dissertation Award. I'm really thrilled to be able to welcome him to our event here today virtually with us. And to have a conversation. So just as most of you know, this will be a conversation between Dr. Lob and myself, although please do drop in your questions into our YouTube link or via our social media handles, and we'll be monitoring those throughout the hour. And if we have a chance to, I will definitely try to bring some of those audience Q&As into our conversation towards the latter half of the conversation. So Eric, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. And it's, like you said, it's good to be back at my alma mater, albeit virtually. And I want to thank you and Dr. Nasser and Britton, as well as Dr. Maura Carlin for helping set this up. So thanks very much for having me.
Yes, of course. So before we kind of get into the meat of your argument and your book, for those who aren't as familiar, we have folks who come into these events who know Iran really well, and others who are don't know it as in depth. So for those who don't know it as in depth, can you just sort of give a brief overview of the Reconstruction Jihad, Sazandagi, who they are, and sort of what led you to this project in the first place?
Absolutely. So the organization can best be described as a rural development organization. And Jihad Sazandagi, as the title of the book reveals, just means Reconstruction Jihad. The organization, the name was interpreted as a holy effort or struggle, not in the military sense, but to improve development and other aspects of Iranian society during and after the revolution. The organization was established in 1979, very close to actually the IRGC, which showed how much significance it had. And the organization, and we could talk more about that, and the organization embarked on an ambitious development campaign, building roads and bridges, schools, hospitals, delivering educational and medical services, also undertaking cultural activities and religious activities increasingly. And in a way was a soft power, I mean, the book argues a soft power mechanism that helped the state win hearts and minds. The rural population was very important at the time. It was about half the population, 50% or so. And this had been really a continuation of what the Shah had been doing in the 1960s during the White Revolution in terms of delivering public goods and social services to gain the support of the rural population.
Yeah, I actually want to get back to what you just said about this being a continuation of the Shah's Sepah Danish, because oftentimes in so much of both popular but also really academic studies of Iran, there seems to be this big cutoff point. Either you study pre-1979 or you study post-1979, and no matter what you do, you kind of stick to that time frame as if things didn't bleed over into time. And one of the things that I really appreciated about your book is how you bridge that divide, actually, the divide that probably we shouldn't even have there, but we do for various reasons. And so I would love to know both that connection that you're talking about in actuality, but also what it means for you to conceptually understand such a prominent institution in the post-revolutionary sphere as seeing it as being more historically contingent and having this longer history that spans the pre and post-revolutionary time period.
Yeah, sure. It's an important point, and one, as you said, that's emphasized and elaborated upon in the book. So the organization was very much emulating what the Shah had done between 1962 up until 1979 in terms of sending out young men and women in lieu of military conscription to villages and provinces around the country. They were part of these organizations called the literacy, the hygiene or health and extension corps to bring services and goods related to education, hygiene, and agricultural assistance to the rural population. And, and this is a way for really the Shah to, in some ways he was encouraged by the United States to do this, to beat the leftists or the communists at their own game and gain the support of rural Iran. And you see the revolutionaries then imitating these same institutions and policies, and yet at the same time, they themselves are framing this as a rupture to legitimate themselves, right? So no one really talked to me about the Shah's core or really wanted to talk about it. They just wanted to talk about their organization after the revolution. And when you look at the speeches of Ayatollah Khomeini, and you looking at the interviews and the discourse of the members of the organization, they really tried to justify their existence and to legitimate themselves, to legitimate the Islamic Republic, to justify the existence of the organization. They framed themselves as a rupture, as something new, and not just as something new, but something that was going to repair the damage and destruction that the Shah had caused to the countryside, which is, really an allegation, because you could say that the Shah, there were adverse effects of his policies and of his institutions, but they also had made gains in some of these developmental areas, right? So it's really, he had a real mixed record in the countryside, as did Reconstruction Jihad, right? And so, you actually, the irony is, or the paradox is that you see similar actions and outcomes by both organizations and institutions, pre-revolution and post-revolution, but the difference really comes in the framing among elites and members as something new, and as creating a new revolutionary order, and really reconstructing the past and remedying the errors of the past, even if that was not fully accurate.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I want to get into some of these details that you're bringing up. But before we do, I want us to take a step back for a second and talk about the framing of your book and the framing of your research more broadly. So in the introduction, you write, and I'm going to quote really quickly, you write early on, quote, "This book serves as a corrective and a supplement to other scholarly works that exclusively attribute the Islamic Republic's consolidation and resilience to its use of repression through coercive institutions, including revolutionary courts, club-wielding partisans of God, and the IRGC. Mansour Moaddel, for instance, contends that, quote, terror is the essence of the Islamic Republic, end quote. Without disputing the importance of repression and understanding the Islamic Republic's historical and political processes and outcomes, this book argues that rural development and other non-coercive tactics also explain its survival and persistence." And I'm ending quote there. So this seems to be, correct me if I'm wrong, but sort of the overall framing of your book as you're driving this narrative forward for us. And you're looking at and trying to understand this non-coercive means of extending the Islamic Republic and consolidating its rule. So I would love to hear more from you about that, and what led you to that framing, and also what's the importance of that, and because I think it fills in a lot of gaps in the scholarly literature on Iran and just sort of our broader understanding. So I would love to know from you about why choose that, and what does it do for you and literature more broadly.
Absolutely, thanks. I mean, and you hit it on the head in terms of the main argument of the book, in terms of looking at and not arguing that coercion is not part of the equation and repression is not part of the equation, but also looking at the soft power dimensions of the Islamic Republic through this institution. And there were others as well that went out to the provinces and villages, Imam Khomeini Relief Committee, the Housing Foundation, and others. So Reconstruction Jihad was not unique in this regard, but it was established very early on in the revolution alongside the IRGC, as I mentioned earlier. And that signaled to me that the organization had some importance. And the question is, why was there such a priority? And I think that part of it was to continue on what the Shah was doing and not neglect that, and to fulfill those promises of bringing development to the countryside, but also the fact that there was this period between 1979 and 1983, where there was a power vacuum and where you had members of the revolutionary coalition. It wasn't just that it was a fait accompli that Ayatollah Khomeini and the Islamic Republican Party or the clerics around him were going to assume power, but they had rivals and competitors within the revolutionary coalition. And there were a whole bunch of actors competing for power in the cities and in the countryside. And so for Khomeini, even though this organization had other goals, right, to bring development to the countryside, to remedy urban-rural inequalities and narrow the disparities between cities and villages, there was also a political dimension to this in terms of trying to not just win hearts and minds in the countryside, and we see other governments doing this as well, not just Iran, but also to marginalize and demobilize in the process the opponents that are out there, and largely leftist opponents as well, not just loyalists of the Shah, but you had these groups that we still talk about today, Fedayeen al-Khalq and Mujahideen al-Khalq especially, that were out there delivering also rural public goods and social services to the rural population. And so Khomeini and the Islamic Republican Party, the IRP, were very concerned about these activities. Not to mention you had ethnic uprisings in the periphery. And so the organization deployed to those areas as well. And admittedly, the first representative, or Khomeini's representative to the organization, Natek Nouri, admits that this was one of the missions, to try to use development. And again, we see it in other contexts around the globe, not just here, to try to pacify these areas and to try to divide the population from the insurgents in those ethnic areas. So, the book argues that the organization was a vital soft power mechanism to help the organization consolidate power during this contentious time. And also then the book goes on to show how the organization then helps the Islamic Republic mitigate its international isolation and its economic hardships, and establish diplomatic and commercial relations in other parts of the Muslim and developing world, in Africa and Lebanon and elsewhere. So it has that internal role, but also the external role as well, with helping the government.
So the internal role that it has, I mean, it plays a really large role. So, or the folks that come into it play a large role sociologically in both who make up the sort of the rank and file of organizations within the Islamic Republic, and then you trace out, who they end up becoming once the organization becomes bureaucratized, and once they begin to demobilize not just the opposition forces to Khomeini, but also once they begin to demobilize once the war is over. So if you can talk us through a little bit about the sociological factors of who these folks are and how that changes over time and what that means for the organization.
Absolutely. So the organization, I argue, is very much a microcosm of the Islamic Republic itself. When you look at the trajectory of the organization on a macro level, when you look at the trajectory of its members and volunteers and war veterans, because one of the other things I forgot to mention is it plays an important role in the war by particularly its engineers, who become basically the equivalent of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and provide logistical support to Iranian forces on the front. But then after the Islamic Republic consolidates power, even before the end of the war, the organization becomes increasingly professionalized and bureaucratized. And one of the things too, this is a story really, as we see, as with the Islamic Republic as a whole, it's really a changing of the guard between elites that have more provincial backgrounds that come from the provinces versus those that were affiliated with the Shah that were more urban centric. And so you see that within the organization, because members of the organization, you see this mobility that they have even before the revolution that then increases afterwards as they take on important positions in the government and the economy and society. And that also mimics the elites that take power in the Islamic Republic, more provincial versus urban elites. So it's very much a story about that. And it also, like I said, reflects the trajectory of elites in the Islamic Republic itself. But then, this process of bureaucratization and demobilization becomes very, in some ways, as an opportunity for its members and allows them to experience this upward mobility. But on the other hand, brings in disillusionment for other members, because the organization was originally conceived as the anti-bureaucracy. The perception that members had is that, and again, affiliating with the bureaucracy with, the Shah, the heretical remnants of the Shah's regime, Taghuti, and basically saying, look, we're the alternative to the bureaucracy. The bureaucrats are sitting in Tehran, they're drinking tea, they're collecting a paycheck, they're looking for their next promotion. They're not going out to the villages and doing the work. And again, this is not necessarily reality. This is how the organization, framed its mission. But then the organization ends up becoming the very bureaucrats that they had, been railing against. And so, there's this contradiction here. On the one hand, we see mobility. This creates opportunities as the organization becomes part of the bureaucracy. And again, reflecting the Islamic Republic's trajectory of increasing bureaucratic centralization that we see in other revolutionary states like Russia and elsewhere. But then, having these contradictory outcomes. Some experience mobility, others marginalization. Some support the bureaucratization and professionalization of the organization, and others lament it because they feel it takes away from the organization's original mission, identity, which was very much based on anti-materialistic, self-sacrifice, altruism, piety, revolutionary fervor. They believe that all those values have been diluted. And a lot of them, when you go to see them in Iran today, are now frustrated bureaucrats. They now need a signature whenever they want to do something, or they, resent their colleagues who are all about getting a paycheck or that next promotion, as they had criticized the Shah's bureaucrats. So there's a lot of interesting and contradictory outcomes that come out of that process.
Yeah, and sorry if on screen I was doing things that looked very odd. I had children and a dog come into the room I was trying to manage here. So I
can relate.
This is our Zoom reality now.
Right.
Before we get into the disinfecting, folks feeling really frustrated at their situations, once things become much more established in the Islamic Republic. And I mean, before we went on live, Eric, you and I were talking about how, for me, it was really fascinating reading your book, because so much of it resonated with the research that I was doing and the folks that I was doing research with. And I could see similar kinds of developments throughout their life trajectories, and also the institutions that they belong to, which leads me to, one of the things that I really appreciated about your book was not only did you have a really extensive array of archival research, that spans institutions and archives and libraries within Iran, outside of Iran, as well as looking at newspapers and different media. But also you did quite a bit of qualitative research on the ground in Iran and later Lebanon. You write in your book that you did over 130 interviews, and you really weave in the micro and the macro. You weave in how these grand changes that are happening in Iran in the post-revolutionary period, what those are for us to understand, but then also you ground them in the day-to-day realities and sort of life changes of these folks as they're going through it. So I would, love to hear a little bit more about the methodology that you use, because I think that allows you to make a lot of the rich arguments that you're making, that if you hadn't done it in this way, your analysis might have been might have yielded certain things, but I think not as much as what this book ends up yielding for all of us.
Thanks. Yeah, I feel very fortunate to have been able to do this research, and it didn't come with, without its adversity. But as you said, it was a combination of interviews and, in some ways, participant observation, along with triangulating that with the archival resources. Because what the archival resources give you in Iran and even outside, like places like the Library of Congress and elsewhere, is it gives you more of that macro perspective on the organization. And you can't really get the micro perspective without doing interviews with former members and volunteers and veterans of the organization, and even seeing on the ground what they're doing today and what their lives are like today. So, as you said, they complement each other, and you can't really have one without the other. The other thing too is that if you only rely on the interviews or you only rely on the documents, there's so much that's whitewashed. And there's always, methodological pitfalls with doing oral histories and people having time to process things and justify why they did things. And, some people portraying the organization in a positive light or negative light because they have some type of agenda, which you're trying to figure out. The documents as well, a lot of it was documents published by institutions affiliated with the government that tried to portray the organization positively. And some members were even honest with me and said, I'm glad you're doing this because we want we want a book with a critical perspective of the organization. And so you have to kind of sift through the documents, the reports, the books, the articles, existing, primary and secondary sources, and even the interviews to really get to the critical points. And even sometimes, with the Ta'aruf culture, this extreme etiquette, to even try to read between the lines of your interviews. And find out what are people really trying to say here, as well as even just navigating. And you may have had these experiences and issues yourself, because inevitably, for me at least, it was snowball sampling. So it was an interviewee that I got lucky enough to meet saying, okay, now I want to introduce you to so-and-so. Well, who are they introducing me to here? And you find that just like everyone today in the Islamic Republic, you have members across the political spectrum. And so inevitably they want to introduce me to their friends and associates who are on one side of the political spectrum. And I really tried to get views across it. And so, you try not to go too far down certain rabbit holes, and you try to triangulate as much as possible to really take a critical position on what's being said in the interviews, as well as what you're reading in the textual sources.
So in that quest, Eric, and also, going back to the importance of the war itself, in both the life histories of these folks that you were interviewing and working with, and critically the Reconstruction Jihad itself. I know that I want to give you a chance to talk about the importance of the war, because it's so fundamental to and so foundational to the Reconstruction Jihad. And also sort of, you point to this later in your book, the nostalgia period that they point to as their great success period, and what they try to consistently recreate in their new cultural productions. And so what were their successes during the war that is such a fundamental part of their narrative, and that also is a fundamental part of that organization and who it is, and later how it ends up developing?
Yeah, and this, resonates very much with your work and the war as a critical juncture in these organizations and institutions' history, and then how it informs their cultural framing, or production, I should say, moving forward. With this organization, and I think you see similarly with the IRGC and others, is that, it's not that the Islamic Republic ever welcomed this war necessarily when it first started. It didn't initiate the war, but once it happened, this was an opportunity for these organizations. One thing that's interesting about the Reconstruction Jihad is it's constantly trying to position itself in a very already factional state between, the Prime Minister Bazargan, the Freedom Movement, these technocrats that wanted things done through the bureaucracy and not through the revolutionary organizations, and then the Revolutionary Council that was more supportive of Khomeini and those around him of the revolutionary organizations. And so the organization used the war really as an opportunity. Even if Bazargan was no longer there, it was still dealing, with Bani Sadra and the president, who was still trying to restrict the organization, always looking for ways to justify its existence and to gain more recognition, resources, and responsibilities from the state. And so this was an opportunity to do that because it expanded, as I mentioned earlier, its portfolio from not just rural development, but using those skills and those aptitudes and responsibilities to now shift them to the war front. So it's engineers providing logistical support. It's people involved in education that were teaching soldiers how to read and providing educational and cultural activities. And other forms of activities as well to boost morale on the front, to provide the forces with critical infrastructure. And at the time, being the longest conventional conflict of the 20th century, trench warfare was critical to this. So the organization had a unit that actually dug trenches for forces to either live in and or fight in. And so as a vital part of this conflict, and their unit became famously known as, and Khomeini may have actually coined this phrase, Sangar Sazane Bi Sangar, the trench builders without trenches, because they were digging the trenches, but they didn't have trenches to protect themselves. So they were oftentimes victims or became casualties of war. And they're very proud today. They still have they have organizations across Iran that commemorate their role in the war. And they always say, we lost at least 3,000, if not more, members during the war while digging these trenches. And of course, still have many sick, as you've talked about in your work with chemical weapons exposure, and other have been maimed from the war. And so today you have associations in Iran that commemorate this. And it goes on in the cultural production of the organization as a way, as you've talked about in your own work, to try to maintain this a spirit of revolutionary commitment and piety among new generations to look towards this organization and the sacrifices it made during the revolution and war, to inspire new generations of Iranians to carry this forward. On the other hand, like everything, there's unintended consequences in Iran and contradictions. So even though this is something that the state welcomes, on the other hand, it's put a lot of pressure on the state because these individuals have now launched a campaign now for a number of years to ask political elites within the state to provide greater compensation to its members. So it's not just that the state uses this for cultural production, but it's now on the hook for providing some form of compensation to these organizations that are somewhat embedded in the grassroots, but also affiliated with the state. So, kind of like parastatal organizations.
So before I get to my next question, I also just want to encourage the audience that for any questions that you all have, please do drop them in the chat and we'll bring them up towards the end of this conversation. So picking up on this last point that you just made, Eric, reading your book, you really sense that, consolidation is really important for the consolidation of the regime is really important for what the Reconstruction Jihad means, but also the way in which you historically and chronologically trace out this organization, you're able to also show us contestation and the various ways in which contestation manifests themselves within those who are loyal to the Islamic Republic. So not just those who are radically opposed to it, which we have a lot of really great literature to understand, but we don't have as much that we have literature that sort of points to the factionalism of the Islamic Republic. But what your book does is it shows throughout time how this contestation sort of shifts and the different ways in which these members put pressure, as you were just saying, on certain elite folks or certain elite organizations to ask for more simply because, or maybe not even simply, but fundamentally because they were such an important arm of the war, as you were just explaining to us. And so how did you see that contestation pan out throughout this time, especially in the post-war period? And what does it teach us about politics within the Islamic Republic today?
Like I said, this organization is very much a microcosm of the Islamic Republic itself. And another way that it is apart from the bureaucratization and the mobility and disillusionment that comes with this organization, is also the internal factionalism within the organization, and then how that interacts and also contributes to the factionalism within the state itself that we still see today. And so the organization, like I said, I mean, this is the irony, and there's always ironies and contradictions to the Iranian case, probably also others as well, which makes it so rich and interesting to study, is that the organization had this slogan, which it still has today as part of now the Ministry of Agriculture, Hameh Baham, all together. We're all together, always playing up this theme of unity, solidarity, collectivity, and yet there were divisions in the organization. Number one, there were divisions along competencies, the engineers versus the educators versus the cultural members and others, having competition and over resources and who was more important than the other. So there were divisions and competition and contestation, as you say, there along those lines, where engineers felt, and of course it's a very prominent profession in Iran, along with doctors, feeling that they were the more important members versus the educators and others. But then along more, I would say, salient political lines, you had disagreement break out between leftist members who, even though they were fighting leftist groups like Mujahideen, Al-Khalq, and others, they themselves had leftist ideas that they wanted to implement through the organization. So they wanted to bring material development to the countryside. They wanted to improve education and health and infrastructure. They were, as Khomeini was talking in his rhetoric, they wanted to institute policies that were populist and egalitarian, like land expropriation, labor collectivization, income redistribution. And so they had high hopes that these things were going to happen, and they never really did. In the early 80s, they got shot down. The land reform bill got shot down in parliament, in the Majlis. And what ended up happening, and you see this happening in other institutions and organizations, is that the conservatives and the rightist members started to assert themselves more and more. And one of the things we haven't talked about this morning is, alongside the war, you also had the Cultural Revolution, which lasted for 3 years and involved the closure of universities, which allowed students to participate more and more in the organization. But what ended up happening during the Cultural Revolution is that more and more conservative, pious, right-wing, we call them, members asserted themselves. And as leftist members complained, the organization became less about material, egalitarian, populist development and more about faith-based development. So instead of building, roads and schools and hospitals, they started building more mosques, more ablution rooms, more congregation halls and seminaries, etc. And so the leftist members started feeling alienated and disillusioned and started defecting from the organization. And so, to this day, we see these divisions because they then infiltrate the state. As they experience mobility, they take on high positions in government. And so, you see these very divisions in the organization between left and right, and the leftists eventually become the reformists, and the rightists eventually become, conservatives or hardliners, however we want to label them or categorize them. You see this now manifest itself within the state and continue on to this day. And it's not an accident that some prominent members on the left of the organization are now prominently featured in the presidential cabinet of Rouhani today. And so, this continues on as we speak.
Yeah, so this fight that you're talking about and struggle, you started out a little bit earlier in the conversation, and you write about this in your book about how the Reconstruction Jihad, in essence, sidelines or plays a big role in sidelining the center left in the revolutionary period. So center left meaning not what gets consolidated as the Islamic Republic, but prior to what gets consolidated. So they play that role, and then once they become a little bit more consolidated, and as the years go by, the right within them ends up then usurping power from the Islamic left. And that story sort of plays on itself again. And we see those, and then that fight sort of continues, and it becomes about the legacy of the revolution. Is that a correct sort of read of both your book and what you were just saying?
Yeah, that's exactly right. To clarify it, and this also speaks to the dissolution of the one-party state itself, the Islamic Republican Party, because as you say, initially the battle is Islamist leftists and rightists, which is in some ways simplistic reductionist categorizations, but for the purposes of our analysis, I think it helps against non-Islamist or non-Islam IRP leftist and rightists affiliated with the Freedom Movement of Iran and Bazargan, affiliated with the Mujahideen al-Khalq and others. Once that power is consolidated in the early 1980s, then they start to have more intensified factionalism between themselves, which is natural to other revolutionary movements and trajectories. And so, as you say, the right usurps the left in some ways, even though the left doesn't go away. And this factionalism within Reconstruction Jihad also manifests itself in the Islamic Republican Party, Khomeini's party itself, leading to its dissolution in 1987. So again, seeing these parallels between the organization's trajectory and the broader state trajectory.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So before getting to, I want to talk about once they begin to internationalize as well. But before getting to that, can you talk a little bit about the relationship between the Reconstruction Jihad, the IRGC, and the Basij? Because at times they're extremely close to one another, and at times they seem very, very far, or at least try to become really far from each other. So how did you see this trajectory throughout the time period that you're sort of spanning in your book?
Yeah. So,
and also, why does it matter? Right? Like why is it we tend to, especially in the United States, but have such a laser focus on the IRGC, but once we do that, we ignore all of these other institutions within the Islamic Republic that play a really big role in power consolidation and also sort of social the social roles that they play. So why does it even matter that I'm asking you this question is what I'm asking.
Yeah, and this is really one of the contributions I articulated in the book, because there are few institutional histories of the Islamic Republic. We have a lot of focus on elites and ideologies, but little on institutions. And when we do look at the institutions, as you said, there's a hyper myopic focus on the coercive institutions, the IRGC, the Basij, and others. So part of my goal of this book is to bring non-coercive institutions into the fold of the analysis of the Islamic Republic, the Reconstruction Jihad, and then we have other books now that touch somewhat on the Imam Khomeini Relief Committee, Kayvon Harris's book, as well as I'm not sure if he touches as much on the Housing Foundation, but there can be more work done on these other institutions, as you said, that get overlooked and that yet still play an important role and are very instructive to understanding the evolution and trajectory of the Islamic Republic. So that's definitely one of the missions that is articulated in terms of the scholarly contribution. In terms of the relationship between Reconstruction Jihad and the IRGC, the book argues that there's really a division of labor initially between these two revolutionary organizations that are new and that are really trying to find themselves during the revolution and the war. And they're they're initially informal, and they become increasingly hierarchical and professionalized, and they increasingly find their way within the system, and they gain crucial experience during the revolution and war as they evolve. But initially, they're struggling to find themselves, and they're dealing with some serious issues, as I said before, with civil conflict and ethnic uprisings, and a lot of this revolutionary contention and uncertainty. And they're working together initially side by side, where the IRGC is this hard power mechanism of the state that goes into urban and rural areas and acts as a parallel security force, while trying to, at the same time gain experience and expertise in the process, as with Reconstruction Jihad, which is trying to smooth things over. And the way that some members described it is, we were there to help these communities, to bring development, to bring goods and services. And sometimes they were met with hostility. in ethnic areas, in areas where the Mujahideen and others had a strong presence. They described being attacked and some even killed, or their colleagues or comrades. And so that's when they had to then turn to the IRGC and the security forces to try to bring stability and security to the area so that they could go about doing their work. And there were even debates, the government was debating whether Reconstruction Jihad members can start arming themselves when they go to these areas, but they insisted that that would not be a good idea, that arms should be kept to the security forces versus this development organization. And so you really see a clear division of labor. Once the organization becomes part of the bureaucracy, it really starts to lose sight of rural development. It becomes more involved with managing the Islamic Republic's national assets. So agriculture and fisheries and other important sectors of the economy and society. And so, today there's kind of a vacuum in terms of who's supposed to be doing rural development. And what's interesting is with all the resources that the IRGC has, you actually at times now seeing it take the lead, as I've written in a recent article with an Iranian colleague, taking the lead in rural development projects, and kind of seeing the construction jihad as really kind of irrelevant or now too stagnant in the bureaucracy to do it. And so it's doing it itself. And there's almost a competition now between the IRGC and the bureaucracy over who really gets to take the lead on rural development in the country.
So this, and both the competition between the organizations, but also the foundational role that the Reconstruction Jihad plays as a development organization. You write about, and you did research in Lebanon, and I know in our conversation, I think last year or a few months ago, I've lost track of all time. Time doesn't mean anything anymore, but we were in a conversation together at a conference in which you were talking about their role in Syria. So you don't touch upon that in the book, but it seems like it's a new project that you're working on. So I would love to have you talk with our audience more about the international, once you write in the book that they take on an international frame early on, but they don't actually start doing international work until a little bit later. If I'm correct, it's towards the end of the war when the war ends. And so can you talk about that? And also, from what I gather through your analysis in the book and what you've been talking about and writing with Syria, is that the insistence of the localization of the Reconstruction Jihad once it does go international, and what does that mean, not just to the organization, but to organizations like Hezbollah in Lebanon and to what's going on in Syria?
Yeah, so you're right. In the mid to late 80s, as the organization, before the end of the war, as the organization becomes a ministry, this is another responsibility that it inherits. It becomes almost like USAID, where it goes overseas in a very formalized way, where there's agreements first signed between heads of state and top officials. It's not like activists are just sent abroad. It's done in a very systematic and formalized way, but the organization begins to act like USAID and start to undertake development, humanitarian aid projects to other parts of the Muslim and developing world. And the book really looks at Lebanon, where it's a natural fit, where there's already this relationship with Hezbollah. Not to say that at first they were trying to figure out exactly what they were doing. It wasn't, entirely cleanly orchestrated or planned. They kind of felt it out as they went along. But ultimately, they work with Hezbollah on creating a branch of the organization in Lebanon to help Hezbollah do the same thing. And for Hezbollah, as part of its social services unit, to deliver public goods and social services to its constituents, to maintain legitimacy and support within its communities, to help it win elections, to help it get recruits and serve important functions for the organization as a political party, as a militia. And so, as you say, that over time, the organization becomes increasingly localized. And you see that the personnel over time diminishes with Iranians to Lebanese and to actually Hezbollah rank and file, which is the case to this day. The organization still exists. And that was, part of my research was looking at how this organization operates under Hezbollah and Lebanon and some of the similarities and differences that you see between the Iranian organization and the Lebanese one. And I think this speaks to the power of, there's so much talk now. We just saw a RAND report on this by Ariane Tabatabai and others, looking at, this network of proxies that Iran has. And I think the localization aspect makes it powerful because it really becomes localized, and locals really have a stake and ownership over these institutions and organizations. They become kind of part of the political and social fabric. It's not that the Iranians could even now necessarily dismantle this infrastructure. It's really ingrained in part of these communities, and involved with local stakeholders and actors. And then, as you said, I have, God willing, inshallah, an article coming out this summer on the organization's activities in Syria, where you see very similar processes and outcomes unfolding, where, the original members of the organization are now part of the Ministry of Agriculture and the government. But the organization has now transformed itself as an extension or a unit of the IRGC's Quds Force. And they brought the same model that had existed during the Revolutionary War now to Syria to do similar things there, where it's not just about IRGC and the militias and the Syrian army consolidating territory through repression, but also using this organization for reconstruction and development and humanitarian aid to try to create stability and gain support on the ground during this civil conflict. And then I guess the last piece is also Africa, which is an interesting story because it's less of a natural fit, right? Where Lebanon, you have this Shia constituency, you have this relationship between Iran and Hezbollah. In Africa, I think it's very interesting because Reconstruction Jihad is mainly operating in Sunni majority or even Christian majority communities in Africa. At times it does work with, marginalized Shia communities or other religious communities. But it has made inroads in Africa because of the context of Africa in terms of rural poverty and large agrarian societies and agricultural economies. And so the organization has made inroads in Africa to help mitigate the Islamic Republic's international isolation, economic hardships, circumventing sanctions, and played a critical role in those areas in Africa as well.
So, you also make a argument in your book about, one thing is your book makes, and as we've talked about this, really important contributions to Iranian studies. But the other thing you're trying to do with your book is to think through what this organization means for the consolidation of power in a post-revolutionary society. So in some ways, sort of the case study is Reconstruction Jihad in Iran, but it also teaches us certain things about what happens in societies that undergo these massive revolutions, whether it's from below in the Iranian case or different configurations of it, and how those states will, first of all, create the state formation and then consolidate themselves. So taking a step back from Iran for a second, what does this case teach us about post-revolutionary societies sort of writ large? Or what are the claims that you want us to sort of take away from this, not just on Iran, but on a grander sense?
Yeah, and the book to some extent touches on this, but I think more comparative work can be done where looking at parallels between the trajectory of this organization, its members, as well as the Islamic Republic itself, and seeing similar trajectories elsewhere. For starters, we see revolutionary states like Cuba, like Nicaragua under the Sandinistas, and there's Farideh Farhid does a comparative study in her work on Nicaragua and Iran. As does Jeff Goodwin and others, in terms of that these revolutionary states, a lot of them actually prioritize these social programs, education, literacy, healthcare, while at the same time developing, once they consolidate, these in some ways are populist programs to gain mass support, while consolidating power and developing authoritarian or semi-authoritarian bureaucratic states. And we see similar things as well in China and Russia. And I think we see similar processes here. as well as, and so, there's this kind of misalignment in some ways between the outcomes, socioeconomic outcomes versus political ones that at least that certain activists and citizens have in mind when they embark on these revolutionary projects. The other thing is when you look at the micro level, you see a similar trajectory here in terms of revolutionary activists. A lot of them were going into this organization not with aspirations necessarily to help politicians or elites consolidate power, but to actually looking at development as an end in itself. As I mentioned earlier, to having these, and this was very much, of course, part of Khomeini and other elites' rhetoric, these utopic aspirations of improving the country's development, of narrowing socioeconomic inequalities between urban and rural, between ethnic minority and ethnic majority areas, which didn't come to fruition for different reasons. And so as a result, the fact that the state and the organization didn't deliver on these revolutionary promises created disillusionment and apathy and fatigue among these activists, who then find themselves at the very place that they had been critiquing, which is the bureaucracy. Right. And they're now feeling constrained there. And so, this has led to a lot of, frustration among these activists. And again, they're not alone, because when you look at other studies on revolutionary movements, you see a same process. But on the flip side, you also see these organizations being a conduit for upward mobility and facilitating that process. So on the one hand, you see people being part of these institutions and even exploiting them to get to high places in politics or the political establishment, the economy, and society. And the others, even if they made it there or they didn't, feeling, these frustrations that these utopic aspirations were not met and that they didn't really accomplish what they had set out to do. And even feeling that politicians were not completely being honest with them about their intentions as well, in terms of where they see these politicians, where they've ended up today and what they're doing today. So I think there's a lot of parallels that could be made on the macro and micro level with Iran and other revolutionary states through this work and others.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I found it really generative for that reason. And one of the reasons I wanted to ask that question of you. In the few minutes that we have left, I really want to, because we are a university and because you also studied at SAIS, and we have students watching and tuning in, you went from coming from a policy school for your MA, SAIS being it, and going into academia. What is it, this relationship between policy and academia? I came in from a completely academic world and landed in this policy school. So I'm coming at it sort of the opposite of you in many ways. But I'm trying to see, and I explore this a lot with our students in the classroom, the connections between policy and academia and what they can inform one another on, but also the specificities that they have. And so I would love to know from you, who was a student at this institution, and then went off into doing your PhD in academic work and doing all of this very long-term research in Iran and Lebanon, working through multiple languages, in doing the research, learning those languages along the way, and working on issues that are constantly in the news. And so you are working on issues and on people and on organizations that are very at the forefront of the news. And the new article that you will hopefully have coming out in the summer on Syria, again, is another one of those cutting edge, constantly in the news topics. But you are very careful in trying to situate it in a deeper historical analysis and trying to understand the folks behind the headlines in a way that will deepen our understandings. And so I would just love to know from you how you see these connections, or how you sort of experienced or saw your trajectory going from a policy school into academia and still working on really relevant policy and news things.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the driving forces of embarking on an academic career, and I always tell students who approach me asking about whether they should do a PhD, is really that intellectual curiosity and that passion. because as you said, it is a big commitment to invest in learning languages, in learning history and culture and politics and society, economics, and it requires a lot, and so it kind of is a self-driven process in a way. I guess for me personally, going through the BA and then the MA at SAIS, as fulfilling as it was, at least personally, I just wanted to keep learning more, and that drove me to the PhD. But it was very much of a personal decision, and at the same time, like you said, if you have an MA, you could already make at SAIS, you could already make a big impact on the policy world, as we've seen students and colleagues do. And I mean, what's I think important, and what you're in a position to do, and others, is to kind of straddle those lines between academia and policy, and to have them speak to each other, because they're like you said, they can really help inform each other and fill in some of those analytical gaps, both for us as academics, who may be less familiar with the policy world, and vice versa. Us being able to bring things that the policy world may not have or be privy to. So I think it's important to kind of always, if you have the opportunity, and I think we do as people who study Iran, to do those things, to have hands in both, or to kind of straddle both. It's nice to do, and to have an impact not just on what people think in the academic world, but also decisions that are made could be very valuable, and to bring that added perspective to decision makers and policymakers could be valuable. And Iran, I think it's particularly tricky because it's such a lightning rod issue, and so, at least as an academic, I try as hard as possible. And I remember actually one of my professors at SAIS, Elliot Cohen, had said to me, if you're going to study the Middle East, try to keep your head down and stay in the middle. And it's advice that I followed, that because, as someone who studies Iran and the Middle East, people try to pull you in different directions. And I think you have to make a really concerted effort to be a scholar with honesty and integrity, to stay in the middle. As I had mentioned earlier, in terms of going and doing interviews in Iran, if you have that opportunity, and interviewing people on all different sides of the political spectrum, because they all have, an important perspective to contribute and give you a holistic analysis on the subject, rather than, and it's hard to do sometimes, as a Westerner, you may be more sympathetic to one point of view versus the other, but you really have to force yourself as a scholar to say, look, I need to do objective, critical, dispassionate analysis on this to really produce, the most holistic form of knowledge on the subject that I can.
Thanks, Eric. That's, I think, both very helpful, and also, I agree, it's a very generative space, both to sharpen our senses of critique, but also to take sides that we wouldn't otherwise very seriously in how we construct, or who our audiences are potentially, or even who our audiences may not be for particular kinds of work that might be very much academically focused, or ones in which we do want to cross over and talk to different audiences. I know we only have 2 minutes left, but we did have some audience questions that have come in really late, but I want to ask them to you in the remaining 2 minutes. And one of them touches upon this question of the resistance economy, or the resilience economy, and how the construction jihad fits into questions of self-sufficiency and questions of resistance economy when it comes to Iran, especially in the sanctions sort of phase that we've been seeing since 2012 onwards.
Yeah, so, Iran has created this narrative of a resistance economy, as you said, vis-a-vis the sanctions that have been imposed by the United States and the international or maximum pressure campaign that it's had to endure. And Reconstruction Jihad has fit into this narrative about independence and self-sufficiency. They, alongside the narrative of the resistance economy, they created their own campaign in cooperation with the supreme leader and other elites about this concept of jihadi culture and management. So that, as we had talked about earlier, that as young Iranians or even Iranians of all ages and classes, we could all learn lessons from this organization and be inspired by it, to take initiative, to make a positive impact on society and on the economy, with self-sacrifice and altruism. And that's a message that's being delivered. I remember actually when I was in Iran researching the organization during the annual Nowruz speech that the Supreme Leader gives, prior to declaring the year of the resistance economy, he declared a year of jihadi management and culture. And I was thrilled. I was like, wow, he's actually speaking about my topic here. But what you learn is that these are narratives, right? And you learn that it's not necessarily realistic, right? For countries to be entirely self-sufficient. I mean, we just saw Iran sign a large agreement with China that we're still trying to figure out the implications of, right? You can't, in the international system, in an interdependent system, just make it on your own, right? So these are nice narratives, but we have to separate the words from the actual policies and actions. Another thing that involved Construction Jihad and then the Ministry of Agriculture more recently, or more relevantly, is that they actually tried to rely exclusively on Iranian wheat production and reduce, if not eliminate, wheat imports, right? And you had the former Ministry of Agriculture, Issa Kalantari, rail against this policy in the media because he said this is depleting Iran of its water resources. And so, while ideologically it may seem like a nice concept, because this has been a part of the Islamic Republic's rhetoric from the beginning, neither East nor West, self-sufficiency, independence, there are consequences to aspiring for complete self-sufficiency. Again, it's that are not realistic, number one, and number two, that may deplete the country of its resources, right? Rather than creating a balance by, for example, between wheat imports and domestic production and supporting domestic farmers. So, like everything, these issues are complicated.
Yeah. I could really continue talking with you, especially now that we've gone on narrative for a really long time. And hopefully in the after times, we'll have a chance to meet up personally at one of the conferences again and continue this conversation. But thank you so much for spending this hour with us and really being generous and sharing your knowledge and talking about your really wonderful book. For those who are in the audience who are educators or who study Iran, I really highly recommend this book. For those who are educators, I really recommend putting it on your syllabus if you teach Iran, because as we were talking about, it gives, you learn not just about the organization, but about these really fascinating trajectories within the Islamic Republic. So thank you, Eric, for your research, for your book, for talking with us. And we look forward to hosting you again soon, hopefully in person one day.
God willing. Thank you very much for having me, for giving me the opportunity to promote the book and really for a stimulating and engaging conversation. I can't thank you enough.
Sure thing. Take care. Thanks everyone for joining us.
Take care. Be safe.